Joining me this week for the interview is Mirko Chardin. Mirko is Novak Education's Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer. Now, before joining Novak Education, he was the founding head of school of the Putnam Avenue Upper School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Mirko's work has involved all areas of school management and student support. His greatest experience and passion revolves around culturally connecting teaching and learning, recruiting and retaining educators of color, restorative practices, and school culture. Mirko is a former trustee of Wheaton College and is the co-author of the best-selling book Equity by Design, which he co-authored with Katie Novak. And that is going to be the focus of our conversation today. So Mirko, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, how you doing? So excited to be here today. So excited.
Great to have you here. It's great to meet you. Certainly heard a lot about you from Katie, and I certainly enjoyed the book a lot. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, but I also found out just recently that you are an active hip hop artist. So toward the end of our conversation today, I'm going to give you the floor and give you a chance to talk a little bit about your music as well. But first, we're going to focus on education and talk about that and dig into equity by design. But before we do that, I want to just begin with your professional journey. Why did you pursue education as a career? And maybe share with us some of the professional highlights along your journey so far.
Sure. So this is it's an interesting question for me because I often say to folks that I didn't pick education. Education
Okay.
picked me. It was something that I wanted to stay away from. Actually, because of the types of experiences that I had at the beginning of my journey
Mhm.
as a learner. I was a kid who landed at high school who had been expelled 3 times from the public school system, who had felony gun charges, and 100% had every desire in my heart to drop out when I became a 16-year-old, because my sense was school doesn't work for people like me. Educators are liars. They're not connected to the world outside of school. And this is not helping me to navigate the dilemmas that make this world a very scary place for me. But I encountered a school that was a public school. But there was a philosophy, a way of being, a culture, certain practices that the educators, promoted and engaged in that really communicated to me that school can look and feel very different. That, I think I often say that school doesn't have to be something that's being done to you. It can be something that's being done for and with you. And, wrestling with educators who believed in universal design, believed in equity, believed in student voice, believed in representation, dynamically changed who I thought I was as a learner, and changed the trajectory of my life. I made commitments as a result of that experience that I would go forward and try to share with as many young people as possible. Now, the fact that school could be very different, because I knew if young people could be exposed to school in a way that worked for them, no
Mhm.
school that communicated it was about making sense of the craziness outside of school, that there'd be more youth who'd be successful.
Mhm.
So I've been committed to being an educator. First in the city of Boston, my come from place is a way of giving back. I became a school leader there. I think I'm extremely proud of being the founding or former founding head of school, the Putnam Avenue Upper School in Cambridge, Mass. Kind of an opportunity to be at the helm of pulling together a school community that revolved around equity, revolved around ensuring that our students are reflected and have powerful experiences. And certainly proud of the work that I've been able to do with Dr. Katie Novak as part of the Novak team, and certainly as one of the co-authors of Equity by Design, being able
Yeah.
to share these ideas with educators across the country, in hopes that we can provide relief, for our kiddos has been amazing.
Yeah. It's interesting when you talk about, how education chose you. I find educators are in one of two camps most of the time. Either school worked for them and now they're back to kind of not recreate their youth, but to kind of continue that experience of education being such a positive experience for them. Or like you echoed, the idea that school was the absolute opposite for them and they're back to kind of contribute to a system that becomes more equitable and more aligned. You had mentioned that you found that, that your teachers in your experience, you said two things that really caught my attention. One, they were liars, and the other was that they were not connected to reality. Can you talk a little bit more about specifically what was it that made you draw that conclusion about the educators? We're not trying to paint broad strokes here
Sure.
with educators, but we're saying that was your experience. So from your experience, what was it that brought you to that conclusion?
Well, for me, there was a very sharp point in the fourth grade where, I will often say to folks that I received a message from my educators, who I thought were good people or well-intended people, but weren't always mindful of the impact of their decision making. That it wasn't okay to be me. And I say that because I'm a child of immigrants. I'm a first generation Haitian American. Always had a great deal of pride in that identity. Until these encounters I had in the fourth grade, where I would have educators who would ask questions when they'd find out about my ethnic background. They'd say things like, Mirko, you don't sound Haitian or look Haitian, or you don't smell Haitian. No, how could you truly be Haitian? And, I got Christmas message, I think, from them. While understanding perhaps it wasn't their intent to make me uncomfortable, but that there was some judgment or bias about folks who hailed from my background.
Yeah.
That sparked within me, at that young age, willingness to start questioning. Hey, why are we studying what we're studying? How come folks who work here don't look like me, or other kids who were in the class? And that's when I encountered that sense of, wait, maybe I also can't trust educators, because prior to that point, I'd always been told that there was no such thing as a bad question to ask, and that I was the future. But when I asked questions about representation, or why we studied, why what we were studying, or how this connected to the world outside of school, folks were sharp with me.
Mm.
They would tell me to put my head down. They'd send me to the principal's office. I'd be told that I was a behavior problem, and that created this experience where it felt like I encountered a lot of educators who would say that they cared, but when there were moments of vulnerability where difficult questions were asked, where there were questions that were outside of the realm of whatever was comfortable for them, I would see them turn on students and see them turn on me and lash out. And that communicated that there was something more going on than what they were verbalizing. And
Yeah.
that changed everything for me.
It's almost a careful what you wish for. On the one hand, as teachers, we advocate for students to become independent thinkers. We want them to be self advocates. We want them to develop that kind of, like, again, independence, and yet not in my classroom, right? And sometimes we can bristle at the things we're actually trying to, or at least we say we're trying to develop in our students. And yet your experience was one where it was, I say one thing, but the experience was another, which is, we want you to be independent outside of my own classroom. Uh,
Yeah,
Fascinating story for sure. Longtime listeners will remember that we've had both Katie Novak and Leanne Young. Of course, you wrote the book with Katie Novak and Leanne Young in the podcast last spring discussing UDL. But for new listeners, let's sort of start with a view from, say, 20, 30,000 feet. New
sure.
listeners, or for those not quite familiar with UDL, Universal Design for Learning, how do you explain it? Like, what is the sort of operational kind of definition of universal design for learning that you sort of utilize to help educators move in that direction?
Sure. Well, I always start by saying it's an educational framework, that it's mindset work, that it's adaptive work. And I always begin the conversation there because I want to be sure that folks understand that we're not just talking about a new list of strategies.
Mhm.
We are talking about, wrestling with how we perceive our learners, how we perceive our role in the work, and what the work is. And that requires us to reflect and dig in and get to those spaces of vulnerability, intentionally, in ways that are very different than traditional teaching. And
Mhm.
I typically layer it by saying, in universal design, there are three, pillars, of that adaptive framework. First and foremost, that we understand that brain science has communicated that variability is a thing, that there's always difference that's in play. Whether or not we think we're aware of it, it's always present. So if we're
Mhm.
truly meeting the needs of others, we plan for difference. And in fact, in our world outside of school, folks typically plan, for different types of clients and customers to ensure that there's, access to whatever their service or business is. We need to make sure that that's happening within schools. Second, pillar is this notion of firm goals, flexible means. When we exist or breathe in this world of education and say things such as high expectations for all, are we truly saying that? Or is it a circumstance where we're saying high expectations for some and different pathways for others? Through the lenses of UDL, we're saying we hold everybody to the same target. Because if we change the target, we understand that we've changed their pathway or trajectory. And that's not our role. Our role is not to evaluate whether or not certain children have potential. It's to ensure that that potential is released. And that goes to that third pillar or tenet, which is the belief that each and every single one of our students has the potential to become an expert learner if the
Mhm.
barriers, if the obstacles, if the things that are getting in the way of them having access are removed, including, if those things that we're removing also lie in the midst of some of our unchecked belief systems and assumptions, about other
Yeah.
individuals. If we address these things, then we can plan and create educational experiences that ensure that our young people get to success because we've taken into consideration difference. We've taken into consideration what it means, for them to get to that target. And we are not letting ourselves off the hook when things are challenging. We're
Right.
realizing, okay, if it's challenging, it's because there are barriers we haven't addressed. But
Yeah.
once we address those barriers, things will work.
Yeah, I absolutely love that, and specifically am drawn to that third tenet because I have found myself recently in workshops and presentations continually sending the message that, for me, the most lethal statement any teacher can make is, "You don't understand, Tom. Our kids can't do that." And when I hear that, I just look at them and I say, "Well, if you think that, then they won't." And they
Yeah.
can't because you will be the one standing in the way of their opportunity to get there. And so that certainly resonated with me for sure. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit. I want you to help us see the Venn diagram, if you will, between UDL and being culturally responsive. You and Katie write
Sure.
on page 114. You write, culturally responsive education brings together universal design for learning, funds of knowledge, and the importance of student identity. So, is it your contention that UDL is ideally aligned with the goal of being more culturally responsive? And if so, and more equitable, and if so, then draw that connection to us through that Venn diagram between the two.
No, absolutely, and I see it not even just as a Venn diagram. I see it
Right?
as the two sides of the same coin.
All
If
right.
we're creating spaces for our young people that provide them with equitable access, meaning that we're connecting them to the content and ways that work for them. If we're truly identifying barriers that get in the way, we have to take into consideration identity. We have to take into consideration journey.
Mhm.
In essence, we have to become students of our learners. We have to make sense of what is it that they know, what is their value system, what's the previous information that they're bringing to the table, so we can identify what are the particular barriers that may be in play. This also requires us to reflect on our own experiences, our own judgments, of other individuals, and ensure that we're not the ones who are superimposing, barriers on our young people, based on belief systems or traumatic experiences that we've had that are not checked. See, when we take into consideration who our young people are, not just as static beings, but as human beings such as ourselves,
Right.
we understand that there's a multitude of layers, in regards to, what influences, what they know or how they're able to enter into a space and feel treated with respect and dignity, and how they're able to enter into a space and, feel treated safely. And, through the lens of universal design, we are proactively taking into consideration all those dynamics and are wrestling with, hey, if this is what the standard says that a young person is supposed to know and be able to do, how can I identify every possible, barrier, or obstacle that's going to get in the way, that's going to limit this young person from showing me, that capacity that they have within themselves. And,
Mhm.
how can I not then take into consideration, their social emotional being, who they are as an individual as it pertains to their identity, how they identify, what that
Right.
means in this space, and what that means as it pertains to their experience or even their willingness to trust me, as an educator. Because if I can't take into consideration trust and that psychological contract, that trusting relationship that needs to be established between learner and teacher, I might then not be aware of one of the biggest barriers that are in the space. If my young people don't feel as if active to me, what it is that's living in their brain spaces as they're wrestling with the content and as they're wrestling with these learning journeys. So for me, one and the same, we're authentically providing all of our young people, with an experience that revolves around them and less of the fact that they are the ones who have potential and that we are actually cultivating that potential as we coach their growth and development, then we have to take into consideration the full magnitude of who they are and not just the slices that we're comfortable engaging with.
I'm curious about maybe an example because I think that for most educators, we would probably understand more the notion of learning diversity in terms of how I learn, taking those barriers away. And clearly, I think your point about trust is well taken, that if I don't trust the person who is leading me, facilitating, guiding me through. But I want to drill down maybe a little bit on how might I recognize I'm being culturally unresponsive or insensitive from an identity perspective in terms of how I present the learning to my class or to certain learners in the classroom. What are some specific examples of where that might inadvertently be happening?
Sure. Well, I think one of the best ways to, to address that in the context of, UDL is through hearing student voice,
Mhm.
and providing opportunities, when we talk about funds of knowledge, to kind of just demystify that somewhat, to provide opportunities, for our young people to share with us information that they know about something. So, for example, in the classroom setting, in a very non-threatening way, great opportunity to gather some information about what my young people know, so
Mhm.
I can appropriately plan for their learning, may be simply to ask, hey, what are some hobbies, or some talents that some of you have that I'm not aware of? How did you
Mhm.
learn these things? What was the process? Is there a family history or connection that's there? Very not threatening. An
Right.
opportunity for a young person to share as deeply as they want or as lightly as they chose. In my circumstance, if I was asked that question, just doing some brief modeling, I would share, hey, a talent that some folks might not know that I have, is that I know how to fabricate things out of carbon fiber and aluminum, to do car work, and that I've actually worked on and have built with my uncles, cars for years and years, and that is because there's been this cultural connection through the five uncles I have as a part of this extended family, this extended Haitian American immigrant
Mhm.
family, where there was valuation that was put on finding rusted or beat up cars and figuring out how we can beautify them, and this competitive nature that lived in my family circle. So sharing that brief question or sharing that brief response in reaction to that question, communicates out to the educator, I would assume, hey, this is an individual who has a value system that revolves around extended family members, and
Mhm.
there is some role that uncles have played in this young man's life, and there is some connection or passion to vehicles and this idea of being able to take something and make it into something else. Now, as an entry point, that might not seem like it's huge or crazy, but as an entry point, as I'm thinking about engagement, or that first UDL guideline of recruiting interest, when I think about engagement, this provides me with an opportunity to say, hey, maybe I'll use some analogies, maybe I'll use some metaphors that connect with some of the things that I've heard from this kiddo or some
Mhm.
other kiddos within the class. Or maybe
Right.
I'll just keep track of this, so when there's opportunity to refer to it, I can, and perhaps reflect back to that young person that I've heard them, and then I'm trying to create a learning experience that revolves around what they know, because they're not an empty vessel, and I'm
Right.
acknowledging that in this moment.
Yeah, it really makes me think that sometimes we make too much out of it in the sense that we think that being culturally responsive is one massive thing that we do in our classroom, as opposed to the accumulation of all of those little moments and opportunities that we take to get to know our learners, understand their backgrounds, and then take advantage of those moments where we can sort of widen the net, if you will, or widen the opportunity to share things, whether it's an analogy or an example. It really comes from the background that I understand with our students. I think that's a really, really important point you bring up there. Now, on page 139 of the book, and I'm not going to quote the book through the whole conversation, but there are some things you say that I think are really, really important. You and Katie write that on page 139, UDL can also be leveraged to meet, and I found this really interesting, the social, emotional, and behavioral needs of students by designing experiences grounded in restorative justice. Okay, UDL and restorative justice. Mirko, walk us through that.
Well, I think it's really about treating our young people with respect and dignity by providing them with voice, and particularly the opportunity to provide voice on whether or not what's happening in classroom is meeting their needs. And that's a very scary thing for educators, because we talked about vulnerability a little bit earlier. It requires putting vulnerability front and center and understanding, hey, this learning journey is not supposed to be about us, it's supposed to be about our young people. And there is nothing, I think, that's more restorative than providing that young person with the opportunity to say, hey, this class session didn't work for me. I know that there was a goal that we were supposed to achieve, but this didn't work with the way that I learned. And there's some other things that I need to get this information. Providing them with that opportunity to, reinforce the development of that sense of self-efficacy,
Mhm.
to reinforce the development of that sense of independence, and to reinforce the fact that their voices actually matter. And, when we say in schools that we are not trying to duplicate compliance, then, we have to get into these spaces in which we can actually hear, from our clients and customers. Sometimes I lift that up for educators. We're service providers. So
Mhm.
we're held to the same standard as any other person in this society who's a service provider. And one of the most restorative things you can ever do is allow one of your customers and clients the opportunity, in an endearing way to let you know that you missed the mark, not because everything is all over, but because they're letting you know, hey, in this caring, trusting relationship, I need you to try a little something else to, help me get where you need me to be in this moment.
Yeah, it is interesting to let our guard down. You talked about self-efficacy, and it takes me right back to earlier when we talked about that third tenet, that if we don't have the efficacy and the belief in our students, how in the world are they going to become sort of their own, have developed their own efficacy and be efficacious about their potential success for sure. So I
Absolutely.
love that idea of creating that opportunity for our students to take a hold of things and honor that their position as valued members and strong members of our community, but also as independent thinkers and learners as they grow toward mastery of whatever they're in pursuit of. Okay, let's finish.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so let's finish up with a final question. It's a two-parter here, and then I want to talk about a question and then some advice for educators. So the first piece is the question, and I think sometimes this goes for many aspects that we try to implement in schools. There's always a light version, right? So I want to talk about, how do I avoid, if I'm a teacher, I want to start implementing UDL in my classroom. How do I avoid UDL light? What are some seductive shortcuts that sometimes educators fall prey to when pursuing UDL, or quite honestly, when pursuing any other program, initiative, framework, whatever it is? What are some of those shortcuts we want to avoid?
I think moving too fast too quickly, and
Okay.
not understanding that it's really about developing your capacity with something, before we start experimenting on other human beings.
Mhm.
And as it pertains to, educational frameworks, it's adaptive first prior to it being technical. I run into a lot of educators who will say UDL sounds amazing, but can you give me that UDL lesson plan template? And my pushback will have to be that, your students are not static beings in the same manner that you as an adult learner is not a static being. So there's no way that we can just automatize this and say, hey, we can just check these boxes and we've universally, supported all of our kiddos. No, the work is much more challenging than that.
Yeah.
And it requires almost a sense of commitment to being an action researcher, because what worked for kids last year, if we're taking into consideration that variability is a thing, even if it was amazing, it's not necessarily going to be what it takes, in the next year. I think the world of the pandemic in some ways has lifted up how vulnerable we are as people and how quickly sometimes we need to pivot to address what our needs are.
Mhm.
And I think I would hold that front and center for folks.
Yeah.
It's mindset work. That third tenet that you have lifted up a couple of times in
Mhm.
regards to our belief about kids. Um, Sometimes I really push educators to think about what that means.
Mhm.
What does it authentically mean to truly believe that all of our young people have that potential to be experts? And what does that then communicate about what our jobs look like and the decisions that we make? If we don't pause to reflect on it, for the sake of wanting to quickly put out the fire, we will miss, a great opportunity to operate with a higher level of precision, so that we can get the job done differently and hopefully, lead to different results.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I'm an educator and I want to get started, now I know, everyone's in a little different place and we all have strengths and that we can capitalize on where we get reaffirmed and all that. But let's assume I'm starting from scratch, which again, I
Mhm.
know very few educators are. But if I'm starting from scratch with UDL, what is what is the way to get started? How do I implement UDL? And I mean specifically, not just implementing UDL, but implementing UDL for the specific purpose of becoming a more culturally responsive teacher. Where's my starting point if I'm starting from scratch?
Well, I think the starting point is, it always is looking at your standards and
Okay.
unpacking them.
Mhm.
What is it that my standards are explicitly saying that a young person is supposed to know and be able to do? Can I wrestle with that, unpack it? Can I create a conceptual framework in my mind of what it looks like when they actually are able to do this at a high level? Then can I take into consideration who my learners are? And can I wrestle with what barriers, I think may exist that will limit them from being able to do this work at a high level? And as I'm taking into consideration the barriers and taking into consideration my learners, let me be sure to take into consideration ability, but also identity. Let me also take into consideration my own identity. And then let's start planning. Let's start putting together,
Yeah.
choices and options that can get my kiddos there. And let me have a willingness to check with them, in regards to how my design has made them feel.
Yeah.
And let me normalize that, because I'm not going to be perfect right out the gate, and perfection should not be what I strive for. No,
Right.
normalizing this approach is what I need to strive for, but I'm not going to get it right all the time, and I need to wrestle with that as well. That can be dissatisfying for educators, because a lot of us like getting the straight A's and A pluses all the time, and this work doesn't look like that. So, I think folks really have to wrestle with that. And again, take in mind that we're not talking about wrestling with a static being. We're talking about a human being, who has a variety of different needs.
Mhm.
And that means that, the work is always going to have a level of complexity to it, that's, going to require some flexibility. And I need to normalize that.
Yeah, I love that you started with the standards. And interesting, I want to get your take on this because this is a question or a statement I get from folks all the time. And it's this conflating of standards and standardization. And I think there are some who might look at UDL and say, well, UDL and standards don't really go together. I know you've gotten that question from folks many times. How do you respond to that? I'm curious just to hear how you respond to it, because I know how I respond to it. But
Sure.
standards versus standardization, we can have standards, we can implement UDL. I see that as being seamless. You do too. But how do you help those who don't see it that way? How do you help them see with a little more clarity?
Well, I think it comes back to this notion of, what are our learners supposed to know and be able to do?
Mhm.
And are we authentically wrestling with, what is that information that we're supposed to be sharing with them? What are the skills that we're developing within them, so that they can do this stuff without us? And if
Mhm.
we don't have clarity, in regards to what those things are, then despite what our best of intentions are, we can't authentically say then that we are, educating young people in a way that's going to lead, towards their future success.
Mhm.
And that's what always pushes me back to standards. Sometimes when I encounter folks who will say that they think standards are all about standardization, I will, realize that perhaps they may have been educators who haven't had the opportunities to sit with standards and engage in exercises where we pull them apart and make sense of them.
Mhm.
The language of standards can sometimes be scary. It can sometimes feel really funky, to wrestle with what that meaning is. But I
Right.
think if educators can identify that target, then we can drive our young folks, towards that point. And without those targets, we can't authentically hold them accountable or ensure that
Right.
they're growing in ways, that are going to be to their benefit and not just
Yeah.
ours.
Yeah, they may not have experienced it themselves as students. They may not have tried it as teachers. And again, there are multiple pathways to a standard. There are multiple ways to demonstrate a standard that meet the full cognitive rigor of that standard. And I think that UDL is perfectly positioned as a framework to allow teachers to really manifest that within their classroom. Mirko, this has been
Absolutely.
been a great conversation. I've got two questions left as we finish up today, and these are questions I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. Here's the first one, and you can take this in any direction you want. But educationally speaking, the question is, what keeps you up at night?
Biggest thing that keeps me up at night is, the fear that, in our industry we are moving away from the realization that our work is all about developing self-efficacy and independence within our kiddos.
Right.
I always say to educators, kids that we're working with are going to grow up and become decision makers with us. And then they're ultimately going to be in the driver's seat of this society. And I want to ensure that I am not riddled with anxiety, because I think that the kids who are making decisions for me don't have what it takes, because I
Right.
know in my heart of hearts I didn't do my part to support them and ensure that they were provided with those tools.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is where our expertise. I know in my work in assessment and grading, I always talk to folks about building your assessment literacy or your expertise is not about you. It's about you teaching the students how to do that on their own behalf so that you don't have to be the one overseeing and monitoring. And I love that
Absolutely.
idea of that self-efficacy. All right, last question as we finish up, and it's a question about success, personal success, professional success, wherever again you want to take this in any direction. But the question is simple. If a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what is your definition of success? How would you answer them?
My definition of success, I would say, is being able to, go to sleep and have a sound sleep at night. Feeling like you've accomplished and made a difference or impact in the world. I
Mhm.
think, especially in the world we're living in right now, where so many are wrestling with different elements of, mental health, so much anxiety. The notion of being able to get to that place of peace and feeling like,
Mhm.
hey, I know I have done a good job today, I think is invaluable. So for me, I think that's what success is. And some days it feels greater than others. But as long as you're able to say,
Yeah.
"Hey, I'm not up at night worrying. I did what I needed to do, and I had a positive impact, and I can rest," then I think we're there.
Yeah, that restful sleep is a really good indicator of a lot of things, isn't it? As we recharge for the next day. All right, Mirko. Before we close out, I mentioned this earlier. I want to give you the floor to give you an opportunity to talk about your hip hop artistry, talk about your passion for music, what hip hop brings to your life, and what is your mission with your music? Like, what is the vision, the mission that you've sort of forged ahead with? As you have this other side to you, this other career that you're trying to grow.
Well, I always say to educators, and in fact anyone who will listen, that who we are in our personal lives is who we are in our professional lives. In our
Mhm.
professional lives, sometimes we wear these personas that we assume that folks can't see through. But for me, I think I've made a conscious decision to say I want to always show up as my authentic self. And brings to the table the fullness of whatever represents, who and what Mirko is. So
Mhm.
music and artistry has always been a part of who I've been as an educator in the classroom. Even as a school leader, I often share with folks that some of my passion, for educating and writing in particularly was due to, teachers who, when I was a disengaged student, helped me see the value of, my rap songs and poetry, and how it was a means of, sharing voice, and how different types of written expression were ways of sharing voice and ideas. And that really showed me, what it meant to be a writer, and it developed a passion within me to want to wrestle with how do we share voice, expression, and ideas in different ways. And for me, that was kind of everything. It was an educator showing me that there were funds of knowledge that I already had and skill sets I already had due to the power of the connection, with this artistry. And it's something that I've never let go of. And I'd like to echo back to educators and the young people, that artistry, sometimes helps us share, our thinking and learning, even our reflections in different powerful ways. And, those are tools that can help us learn, grow, and make sense of things. And then as we talk about creating spaces that are universally designed, we have to take into consideration the fact that some of us do our best thinking, when we are able to wrestle with melodies. Some of us do our best thinking, when we are able to draw. Some of us do our best thinking. My wife is a former professional dancer. Some of us do our best thinking when there's an element of, kinesthetic expression that's there.
Mhm.
And we need to not place shame or blame on these different elements of who we are, and particularly in the realm of academia, because it's all about how we as human beings are making sense of some really complex ideas, wrestling with them, and sharing that information back to others in community. So hopefully we can continue to grow and learn as a society. So for me, I feel it's near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, I love that. Showing up as our authentic selves. So where do we find you? YouTube, Apple, Spotify. Where can we
So
find you?
all digital music stores,
Okay.
wherever you listen to music, if you search for my full name, Mirko Chardin, you'll find stuff that pops up. You'll find music videos, you'll find different albums, you'll find features on mixtapes. I have been doing this since I've been a teenager, and I have no intention of letting it go.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I love learning about educators who have other sides to themselves. And as you said earlier, the authentic self, who you are as a complete person, not just as an educator. Listeners, of course, as Mirko said, you can find the music on any digital music store or YouTube, any places like that. But you can also follow Mirko on Twitter. The handle on Twitter is at Mirko Milk. And on Instagram, it's the opposite. It's at Milk Mirko. All lowercase, all one word. And of course, you can connect with Mirko at the novaceducation.com website. Mirko, it was really a pleasure having you here. Thanks for doing
Thank
this,
you.
man. I really appreciate it.
No, it was an honor. It was fun.
Great.